Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Dungeons and Dragons stream. My name is Dwayne, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about some world building. So if you tuned in last night, or you're watching the restream, you know that we talked about my Dungeons and Dragons Epic Edition, which is basically my sort of revision of the D&D rules. Tonight we're going to be talking about specifically another project that I'm working in parallel with that, and that is some world building for a unique fantasy world that I'm creating with some of my students. So let's talk about world building for a second. Specifically, the topic of world building is got a lot of different layers to it. A lot of people have opinions on how exactly to do world building. Sorry, obligatory water consumption on stream. So there's a lot of opinions on how to actually start building a unique custom game world. And I think it goes back to, let's just sort of go back in time to when D&D first came out, or at least when I first started playing D&D. The concept of a pre-set game world, I don't think really started to make any headway until Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. When I got my first red box Dungeons and Dragons set, it was basically just sort of game world agnostic, which means it wasn't a factor. You could play it in any setting you wanted. It wasn't until Advanced Dungeons and Dragons came along where they really started to sort of push for this pre-created game world. And I know the first experience I had was with a game world called Greyhawk. And it was basically the default standard advanced D&D game world. I think it did come with a box set with a lot of lore. My dungeon master at the time had it. But what really struck me as amazing was that he pulled out this map. And this map was hex-based. And it basically had the game world right in front of us. So we had previously just been playing adventures in a generic fantasy land, meaning we did a dungeon adventure, we did a forest adventure, we did all these adventures, but we never really thought how they connected to the greater world. We just assumed they were out there somewhere. We could travel. But then when we saw this map, we were like, wait a minute, I can go there, and I can go here, and I want to go here and do this in this area and stuff, right? So the world, kind of opened up to us, and the game kind of expanded at that point. But it still didn't really play a big role in my moment-to-moment adventures. I'd go to the store, I'd buy a module, and it would say this module takes place in this forest. Great. We ran the adventure, and there was no need to worry about what towns were nearby and things like that. Again, these are my early days of playing D&D. And then I started to see more and more emphasis put on game worlds. The next one to come along was Forgotten Realms, and Forgotten Realms was this really cool game world that had been scripted out, and they had actually started writing novels set in this game world. So there was pre-established lore and material that you could read, which was really cool. I never really jumped into it. A little bit afraid of it, possibly the idea of somebody else telling me what the lore of my world and the history of my world was. So it made me a little nervous. It meant that I had to do more reading and more research and to make it fit with my games. I shouldn't say that I never dabbled with Forgotten Realms, because my first experience with adhering to a game world came when I started playing Oriental D&D back in the 80s, and they came out with a module that outlined the area that all these adventures took place. But not only that, is the adventures actually started connecting the dots. They would actually have the players traveling from one place to the next, and actually laid out a lot of lore and a lot of information on these individual little places like towns and areas. Not too long after that, they actually came out with a box set called Karatur. Previous to that, I actually started gridding out my own world map for Oriental Dungeons and Dragons based on what I could piece together from the modules and such. When the box set came out, it actually had the whole hex grid map treatment, tons of lore. And I wish, going back now in time, that I had actually embraced that product a little bit more. But what happened is, as typically did, is I was overwhelmed with the amount of content being pushed at me, as opposed to me being able to create myself. One of my fallbacks as a dungeon master throughout all my years is that I've tended towards my own personal created content, whether that be adventures and such, versus published content. It's probably just something to do with my brain and the way it works, but I've often felt overwhelmed when I'm sort of beholden to existing lore. I think a lot of it came down to times when my players would read ahead on said lore and evoke that as a way to override my decisions and such when I played D&D. So as it stands, I kind of always wanted to create my own stuff. So it brings us to where we are now. Now, about 4 years ago, I embarked on a quest of being a full-time professional dungeon master, where I actually got paid to do it. And I had 4 groups of players that would be having 4 different campaigns. So I had D&D 4 nights a week, and I ran it with 4 different groups. So about 16 players in total, 16 to 20 players in total. And I said to myself, how am I going to keep track of all this? But also thought this is an opportunity to build out some really cool lore. So what I did is I created the early seeds of a game world, created a map, some places, names, etc. And I basically placed these campaigns, these adventures in that game world with these players, with the intent of one day maybe blending it all into a fantasy cinematic universe or fantasy universe that I had created. And I did that quite well. I think I actually ran that for about 2 to 3 years. And I basically got to the point where I was, the players were outpacing my ability to create lore. So the adventures were moving quickly. We were going through lots of places, and I just was making stuff up on the fly so quickly that I was burning out, right? So about a year ago, I took a step back and said, you know what? Let's start a campaign that takes place in an established game world. And we started down this path of playing. I'm currently playing Forgotten Realms, a campaign in Forgotten Realms on Mondays, and on Tuesdays and Sundays, I'm playing a Dragonlance campaign. So where does this new game world fit in? Well, as I expected at one point, I started to feel detached from the Dragonlance world. Now, Forgotten Realms is going well. It's for a younger group of players, but for some reason, the Dragonlance world, as vibrant, as cool as it is, I'm starting to feel a little stifled by it. It could be the module that Wizards of the Coast created, where it's a set adventure path, and maybe that's the thing. I was expecting more to be a free form, sort of giving me ideas to create adventures in the Dragonlance world, but it just definitely feels like a railroad of, do this, here's what's next, and I'm just going down the bullet points. And I've been trying to insert my own sort of narratives and stuff to slow the train down, because quite literally the book just goes from point A to B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to the Z, at which point you're apparently level 10. So that's been frustrating for me, because I've had to slow down my pacing by going through the book and finding elements where I can pull back and just have fun. Problem is it's in a game world that none of the players have read about, so they don't have any basis for the lore. And the game world doesn't really resonate with them, really, to any great degree. I mean, I guess I could ask them specifically if it does, but my guess is that it doesn't. So I said, well, let's resurrect my old game world. I retired it for a while, a couple summers ago. Let's maybe bring that back and put a really strong emphasis on it. And not only that, but gather some creators, some students that want to build this game world out and have their own personal stamp on it. So that's what I've done. I've gone and started that process. So tonight, I'm just going to walk you through some of the content I have, and also hopefully pull back the curtain on sort of how I go about creating game worlds and world building. And again, it's different for everybody. So I'm going to start with where we started, really, is we said, how do we start this process? And I said, well, I've always believed my mantra for world building is start small, build out big. I've talked to other DMs over in the past, and they spend, months and months creating these epic landscapes and worlds with lore and all this stuff. And that's cool too, if that's how sort of your brain works. But I've always felt that some of the best campaign worlds start with small stories, and you can sort of balloon them out. It's kind of like, I want to say it's kind of like certain cartoons or movies where, the episode starts with just a very confined, a lot of storytelling does actually, starts with a confined area. And as each episode of the show moves along, you start seeing more and more and more of this game world. The Walking Dead comes to mind, right? When we first see the first Walking Dead, it's a very sort of claustrophobic view on the zombie apocalypse. You have a couple characters in a very specific spot, and then as the episode goes on, you start pulling back the curtains, and you see more of this world. And then eventually by the Walking Dead later seasons, they're traveling all over the place to different areas, right? So that's sort of how I view this. I view start small, grow big. I'm gonna have a sip of my water. It's actually sparkling water. Okay, so everything starts with a name. Now, the way that we're approaching this is that we're going to go and use the format that I really loved back in the early 90s, which was the gazetteer system. TSR published basically small little booklets or books that would sort of expand on specific areas, and you just kind of went into the store and you bought the book that was relevant to maybe the area that you were adventuring in or that you planned on, or just if you wanted to have them in general. So I said to one of my students, I said, well, let's build a gazetteer for a starting area. And so we're talking about it and getting ideas, and I said, you know what, let's call our area, our starting area, let's call it the Feather Sky. And we'll say it's the Realm Gazetteer Feather Sky. And that's going to be our sort of small building out. We haven't put together a world map yet because really the relevance isn't there. Players don't have a GPS, they don't have Google Maps. So an adventuring party or an adventurer in this game world who starts in this region, for example, wouldn't necessarily have a greater view of the entire game world. So right here we have our Feather Sky Realm Gazetteer. Some beautiful cover art that I put together. And we started off with some basic map building. Now, map building in the sense that we don't have a quantifiable hex grid to say where these things are, but basically we've just taken map icons and images and created some personality, some stuff that is going to make up the player's game world in the short term. So we said, well, let's create a town. So we created a town, we gave it a name. In this case, the name of the town is called Summer Nest. My student said maybe this should be just a small village, not a town. Maybe it's a village that's just starting to get built, and it's being built on the remnants of an older town that has since moved and blossomed. So we said, well, what's that older town? We called it Whisperwen. And Whisperwen is the town, bigger than a town, smaller than a city, where Summer's Nest conducts business and trade and commerce with. You'll see as well we have a generic icon there that looks like a camp or a house of some kind. Not too sure what that's all about. We added a lake, because every good campaign needs a lake. In this case, my student named it Lake Serenea. So again, just random names that come to mind that sound cool, but not necessarily any meaning behind them. One idea that I had, and I talked to my student about it, was that when I was little, my grandfather and my family in Nova Scotia, we would always visit a place called McGill's, and McGill's was a lake. And on that lake was a fishing lodge or cabin. It was co-owned by a lot of people, but it was basically this big cabin that could fit probably like 20 people. And there was bunk beds, and some of my earliest memories were just going over to McGill's Lake, and we had to take a canoe or a boat over there, and just unpacking and living in this cabin for like a few days, right? And the neat thing about it was a shared kind of thing where other fishermen would come and visit, and they would camp for the night and go out, and all of a sudden all these people and friends and family from the area would just sort of migrate to this cabin over the course of the weekend and just hang out. So it was kind of cool, but I thought maybe that might be an interesting way to integrate the idea into a fantasy world. Why are we always treating the town as the hub and all the adventures meet in the tavern and all that? So the idea we came up with was this adventuring lodge. And it was sort of a shared lodge where adventurers come and go from the area as they're conducting adventures. Great way to meet non-player characters, and just a great gameplay tool as well. So we sort of created that, and we haven't named it yet, but that's what that little thing there on the screen by Lake Serenea is. We have a river network that flows through the lake and beyond. Then I said about adding some forests. As you can see, we've got to have some wilderness and some hills. But then I sort of threw in some extra stuff here. So we have a forest called the Webthorn Forest, and that makes up the bulk of the forest north of Lake Serenea. And then we also have something called the Forgeworks Mine, which is buried in the mountains. We haven't named the mountains yet, but we thought that would be a great home for some dwarves. So what you're seeing here is kind of the genesis of our area, of the Feather Sky region. Without getting into too much technical detail about distances and stuff, we've created this sort of bare bones, story-driven map of the area where we can start telling stories and we can start elaborating on things. And I'll show you here right now on some of that we've done. So the first thing my student and I started doing was we started building out this concept of a small village called Summerness. We knew that we were going to have a hub of some kind for players to come and go and meet people and NPCs and maybe do some quests and shopping. So as written here, we said a caravan fleeing destruction of home decides to stop and rebuild. The players have a part to play in this new beginning for the wanderers. The players, adventurers, quickly become friends and allies with the new townsfolk and agree to help them in rebuilding, protecting them from danger and exploring the lands around the new town as it grows. Their journey begins now. So my student has set a population of about 30, mostly farmers and tradesmen and women with a handful of skilled warriors to help protect them. So some personalities that we've created is the mayor of this little village, called Mayor Crinkle. She's a little goblin. And we have Crumble, who is her silent bodyguard, a very big, beefy orc barbarian looking guy. One player character that I created is Rook Mardigan, a retired adventurer turned sheriff of this little community. And then we have just a random, I thought I'd piece it together. We need somebody who runs the local eatery/tavern. Her name is Cherry Windbreath. Now, you're probably wondering, like, if I've gone and created all these names, like, obviously I've got to have a great backstory and all this stuff for them. But the truth is, no. One of the mantras that I've always had in making a game world feel more realistic for players is actually naming the NPCs. Early in my DM days, I learned very quickly that if you started dungeon mastering games and had players interact with NPCs but didn't have names for them, so the barkeep, the shop vendor, the mayor, very quickly my players started getting astute and said, okay, Dwayne, what's the name of that mayor? Because I want to know the name. And I started making up names on the fly. And the stupid thing is I started forgetting them on the fly, which means, revisiting these characters became a pain because I would forget their names. So I started writing them down. And the big thing about this from a storytelling point of view is that having names attached to NPCs is a great way to build in that flavor, that lore and that that narrative feeling that they're a part of something versus just a generic, oh, he's a bartender. So we started about doing that, and everything I do from this point on has names attached to it for that reason. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Feather Sky region. Why did I name it? Well, I named it because it sounded cool, but I'll tell you how I elaborated on that. So the Feather Sky region, so named due to its large amount of bird population that flies overhead at all times of the year. The region has a problem with a large amount of cultist activity. These cultists are always prowling the forest and hills looking for slaves and worse. While not a daily threat, travelers would be wise not to stray from the roads or be caught alone at night in the forest. The cultists are opportunists, but mostly not above waging fights with travelers that appear to be particularly weak. Of particular concern is a sect within the cult named the Stalkers, dark rangers who comb the forest for the cultists. No one has seen their faces, and they wear full masks and hoods that conceal their identity. That was a little flavorful piece of background lore that my student came up with. So we now have Presto, an antagonist for our little region. Now, I said earlier that I created these characters, Rook Mardigan, and I'll give you, I'm going to admit I'm very visual. I saw this picture on the internet when I was looking at images one day, and I said, that guy looks really cool. And as I always do, I said, there's got to be a story, behind that art. So thank you very much, Unsung Artist, who is the source of my inspiration. Rook Mardigan is a retired, quote-unquote, retired hunter with a past that would tax any bard's ability to sing about it. So he's got a long history. While more than willing to talk about it, he often struggles to find anyone who can sit through a single one of his many tales. Cranky and full of judgment of younger adventurers, he often can be found patrolling the woods near Summer Nest, and of course the local tavern. On rare occasion, he may enlist the help of other adventurers. So a quick little backstory for Rook Mardigan. This is an NPC now, so we've been playing some games in this game world, about 2 so far, and I've used him to great effect. He acts as a conduit to the adventurers so far to get them helping him. Rook is not the kind of sheriff / ex-retired adventurer who wants to spend his days adventuring. He prefers a more peaceful life. So he uses the player characters as proxies for himself by passing work on to them. He operates on behalf of the village, so any money that would be obtained would be money put together by the villagers and not by Rook. So another aspect of this is I said, we have an antagonist, but we don't really have an antagonist. We don't really have a protagonist. So yes, I'm borrowing from D&D here, but in Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms, they have an organization known as the Harpers. I mean, heck, Star Wars has Jedi Knights and Sith. The Forgotten Realms have the Harpers and the Zentirium. So it goes without saying that every good, fiction has an antagonist organization and a protagonist organization. So the counterpart to the cultists are the Dawn Guides. Again, a name I came up with just because it sounded cool, but I elaborated. So the Feather Sky region is not without its protectors and heroes. An organization loosely formed from the ranks of adventurers and champions of the land have risen up to protect those who need it. While not a formal organization and having no cohesive leadership, they do act as quote-unquote sheriffs of the land and forests in the region. So tales of cloaked warriors appearing at a night to save a village from monsters or worse cultists are starting to become common. Choosing to hide their identities for fear of retribution, they are the guardians in the night, ensuring the safety of those they guide. So think of them as fantasy versions of Batman. They don't wear masks necessarily, but they keep their identities hidden while they're doing their acts of goodness. So I went ahead and actually made a homebrew background for players now. So if you are a player character playing in this game setting and you liked that piece of fiction and lore that I created, there's an actual background for it in my campaigns. It's called the Dawn Guide Initiate background. So that's kind of cool right there that I've gone and done that. Here we have some sample art, again borrowed from good old-fashioned internet, but we're starting to build out the look and feel of these cultists. We have masks, white masks, and red cloaks as sort of initial tell that you're dealing with them. My student has gone further and started looking for some real sort of goth fantasy horror elements to really strike fear. These ones here are the ones that he was referring to that have the masks called the Dark Rangers. Haven't used them in the book yet, or in the adventures yet, but we'll get to it. Some more artwork. So for myself, I wanted to flesh out some of the region geography-wise, and that's why I added that area of the woods known as the Webthorn Forest. So I thought it was kind of a cool name. Again, everything I do here is just based on really cool names that I think up in the shower or while I'm lying in bed trying to sleep at night. My trick is actually, when I come up with these ideas, is actually remembering them come morning. So sometimes I have to write them down, or I get up in the middle of the night and run over to my computer and type something up. Bleak, twisted, and filled with creatures that call darkness its home. The Webthorn Forest is a large expanse of forested land, widely avoided by most in the Feather Sky region. Goblin tribes vie for dominance of the forest, and other creatures feed off the remains of casualties of said skirmishes. The cultists have been drawn to this conflict and will sometimes hire goblins from the prominent Webthorn tribe to serve as soldiers in their nefarious goals. When the sun shines bright above the lands of Skyfeather, the Webthorn Forest remains dim and dark with its dense foliage and thorn-ridden bushes. Kind of a foreboding area of the map. And I went and created a Webthorn Goblin, so a goblin variant of your typical goblin that players can encounter. And again, that's actually another cool thing, and I'll highly recommend that if you can personalize the creatures in the monster manual, it's going to go so far towards creating a unique experience for your players, because you're going from generic to a unique, right? So yes, I built it off the goblin template. It's basically a goblin, but I'm going to show you here where I made it different. So in this case, we have armor class, hit points the same, but speed, I've added in a stat called climb 40 feet movement speed. So Webthorn goblins are very adept at using trees in the forest to their advantage, often using rope to swing from tree to tree, stalking their enemies. Some goblin raiding parties will stay entirely in the trees and rain arrows down on their foes, while some prefer to engage with their axes on the forest floor. So I've added an ability there. They do have their nimble escape, but I've added called treetop ambush. This is unique to the Webthorn goblins. So Webthorn goblins typically ambush wanderers by dropping down from the trees of the forest like a spider on its web. In this case, they use silk rope secured in the trees and slide down to the forest floor to ambush enemies. They gain advantage on their stealth check for player passive perception by attacking this way. and I also have them with a stealth of +6. So they're ambushers, essentially. They're ambush goblins. But I've given them a name, pulled out a unique image from the internet, and Bob's your uncle. You got yourself a unique villain. Another NPC, I'm not really elaborating on this slide, but his name is Toblin Morrowstock, and the players have already met Toblin. And the neat thing, this could very well have been just a generic NPC that they said that they bumped into. In the adventure's case, they needed to secure the use of a rowboat to take care of a quest for Rook Mardigan. So I had them interacting with this Toblin Morrowstock. The neat thing about it, though, is that Toblin isn't going anywhere. He's an NPC in the town. So now that I've established who he is, what he is, and his personality, it's feasible that these players might bump into him, and these relationships will develop, right? It's a small village. So this isn't Toblin's stats, this is his rowboat, but again, Toblin and his name. So I've named the NPC. Currently, on my Friday groups, I'm running an adventure dealing with some gnolls in the area. And we originally hadn't really thought about gnolls, but I wanted a humanoid monster that would act as a foil to the players as they moved around the area, as opposed to just having goblins all the time. So, in this case, I settled on gnolls. And they've already encountered a group of gnolls once. And it was some poaching gnolls. And I created the narrative that these gnolls are kind of moving closer and closer to Summer's Nest, getting a little bit more brazen with each encounter as they're sort of encroaching on the village. So that might lead to an encounter at some point, but I'm just kind of building it up slowly and letting the players get a sense that this game world that they're in is evolving with them. And it's not just this is what it is from the moment you start playing. So I have had them encounter some gnolls. I called them gnoll poachers. Their latest adventure, I had some more gnolls, and I've started creating sort of offshoot gnoll variants. So I'm probably going to start adding some of those into our homebrew monster compendium. But yeah, so that's what that is there. And I think that is it right there, just a duplicate of the map. So just a little glimpse at sort of what I'm working on as far as how I do my world building. Now, we currently have 3 areas of this game world that we're working on. This one is called the Feather Sky region. It's the Feather Sky Gazetteer. I have one region that I'm working on called the Dust Haven Gazetteer, and that is a desert biome, I guess you could say it. I've always I started using it about 2 years ago and fleshed it out. So I've got a lot of existing material that I can draw on. But what I loved about it was I was able to sort of create this deserty old west Dune meets D&D kind of region. And I love the old west vibe mixed in with D&D, the idea that the adventures are kind of like, you know, cowboys in the old west and there's problems and stuff. So I'll be fleshing that one out. And another one of my students is working on a region called the Silverfall region. And the Silverfall region is basically sort of your stereotypical elven forest concept. But he's doing some really great stuff there as well. So we've got a couple of these things on the go. And again, all work in progress, but the idea is that combined with our new edition of D&D that we're creating in this new campaign world, we can really put our own personal stamp on the game. So thanks for tuning in. It's a late night stream, so hopefully you catch the restream on this. And if D&D is not your cup of tea, don't worry. I am going to be streaming other topics, just that I had a lot of D&D content floating around in my brain that I wanted to get out and share with the world. So as I start to do more of these streams and get comfortable doing them, you're going to see different content on here. So it's not all D&D all the time, but you'll definitely see that pop up. So hope you all have a great evening. I'm going to sign off now and probably hit the sack or play some games before I go to bed. So thank you very much. Talk to you soon.